Hi, welcome to the first lecture of week 9 of Introduction to Logic Online, right? Philosophy 1500.02. This week, it's the week before spring break, right? So I guess I would prefer not to start new material, but here we are. Anyway, what we're doing this week is, I think, really easy. Hopefully you find it easy. There's just some memorization involved, but yeah. Anyway, this corresponds to chapters 4.1 and 4.2 in the book, right? At least in the 12th and 13th editions. Before that, if you can't find what we're talking about, email me and we'll sort it out. Anyway, what we're going to be talking about this week is categorical propositions, right? So I'm going to start off by talking about why we're talking about these, right, and how it fits into the sort of broader themes of the course, right? And then we're going to, in this lecture, look at categorical propositions as like a class, right, and talk about what they're sort of made out of, what their components are, right? So let's get started. Okay, so what we've been doing so far in this course, right, is talking about validity. We ended up with a really nice, mechanical way to check whether or not certain arguments are valid or invalid. So, I don't know, why don't we just sort of pack up and go home? Well, it turns out that there are certain arguments that seem valid, right, but we can't capture this with sentential logic or truth tables. So sentential logic, right, this is the logic that deals with the logical operators, like and, if then, etc. So let's look at some examples. So here's an argument, right? I want you to think about whether or not this seems to be valid or invalid, and then we'll use a truth table to check. So here's the argument: all doctors are individuals who are hardworking. All individuals who are hardworking are individuals who earn lots of money. Therefore, all doctors are individuals who earn lots of money. Okay, so is that a valid or invalid argument, intuitively, right? Well, it sure seems valid to me, right? Suppose the premises are true. Well, it seems the conclusion has to follow, right? The conclusion also has to be true. Good. So I hope you agree with me on this. This seems like a valid argument, but here's the rub, right? We can't capture that this is a valid argument with a truth table. So let's see why that is. So I want you to symbolize this argument and construct a truth table. So pause this and do that. So we should come up with something like this, right? Each premise in the conclusion, these are different atomic sentences, right, or simple statements, right? So we'd symbolize it something like this: P, Q, therefore R. Now let's see whether we can make the premises true and the conclusion false at the same time. Well, what do you know? Here's a really short truth table that shows it. I've chosen the row where P and Q are true. That is, where the premises are true and R, the conclusion is false. Right? In that situation, P and Q are true, right, and the conclusion is false. Since there is such a row in the truth table, what do we know? Well, we know that the argument's invalid, right, because it's possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false. So let's sort of think about what just happened, right? So we have this argument. It seems valid, right? We go to check whether it's valid, and it comes out to be invalid. That's bad, right? So let's sort of think about what we're doing, right, when we have our logics, right? So part of what we're trying to do is capture good reasoning practices. It sure seems like this argument would be a good sort of argument to make. Right? It's safe, right? If the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. At least that's the way it seems. But, right, it seems that our truth table method is unable to capture the intuitively valid argument. All right, so this argument's invalid in sentential logic, but it's intuitively valid. Okay, so what do we do? Right, so we're going to talk about a different sort of logic in the next few weeks in this course, right? So we started off, up until last week, we were talking about sentential logic, right? Again, this is the logic that deals with the logical operators. And And what we're going to do now, right, is talk about a logic that deals with like all and some and no. Right, so we're going to call this syllogistic logic. So what we were working with, sentential logic, right, it captured the forms of arguments related to the logical operators. Again, these are things like the horseshoe, the triple bar, and the dot. Right? These are logical operators. They're functions from truth values to truth values, right? So some of them take two t's and spit out a t, that sort of idea, right? So the logic we've been working with is concerned with the logical operators, right? It captures intuitively valid argument forms where the sort of logical structure in the argument has to do with those logical operators. So the logic we're going to work with next, right, captures the form of arguments related to quantifiers, subject terms. I don't actually know. I should have looked this up when I was reading the lecture here. I don't know what the plural of copula is. I think it's probably copulae. I'll probably say copulas. Anyway, quantifiers, subject terms, copulas, and predicate terms. Right. So what we're going to be doing in this lecture, right, is talking about what those things are: quantifiers, subject terms, the copula, and predicate terms. So this logic that we're going to work with is syllogistic logic, or the logic of syllogisms. Right. So what's a syllogism? Well, we'll talk about it more in the next few weeks. But the idea here is that it's two statements that are categorical propositions, the things we're learning about this week, right? And a third one, which is designated as the conclusion and is also a categorical proposition, right? And the first two are supposed to entail the conclusion, right? So we'll get more precise on this in the next few weeks, but that's the idea, right? It's something like all men are mortal. All mortals are, I don't know, things that die, right? So all men are things that die, right? Those sorts of arguments. But before we figure out how that logic works, right, before we study that logic, we need to spend some time figuring out the form of the individual like premises and conclusions of syllogistic logic. And again, these are categorical propositions, so that's what we're talking about today. So here are examples of categorical propositions. So first, all governments that bargain with terrorists are governments that encourage terrorism. Second, no vampire movies or films without blood. Third, some symphony orchestras are organizations on the brink of bankruptcy. And fourth, some CIA operatives are not champions of human rights. So I doubt we're at a point where you can just look at these and see sort of what they have in common. So let's sort of keep going, right? And then we're going to talk about these in turn. Okay, so we have these four categorical propositions, right? Categorical propositions are made up of four components, right? So our quantifier, our subject term, our copula, and our predicate term. Good. So let's talk about those four components. So quantifiers, right, there are three: all, no, and some. Right, so all men are mortal, no men are mortal, some men are mortal. In each of those, right, all, no, and some are quantifiers. So in our four examples, right, in the first one, all governments that bargain with terrorists are governments that encourage terrorism. All is the quantifier, right? In our second one, no vampire movies or films without blood. No is the quantifier. In our third, some symphony orchestras are organizations on the brink of bankruptcy. Some is our quantifier. And then finally, some CIA operatives are not champions of human rights. Again, some is the quantifier. Okay, so every categorical proposition has a quantifier. They all start when they're in standard form, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, right, with a quantifier: all, no, or some. Okay, next we have the subject term. So it's important that we don't confuse this with like the idea of a grammatical subject. So in the sentence, all men are mortal, the grammatical subject, right, is all men. Here we're doing something different, right? So the subject term is what follows the quantifier and comes before the copula. So we should sort of skip over this for now, but we'll come back to it. Let's get quantifiers and copula on the table, right? But before that, here's what the subject terms are in our 4 examples. So governments that bargain with terrorists, vampire movies, symphony orchestras, and CIA operatives. Keep this in mind as we go forward and see if you can't figure out what's going on here. So next we have our copula. There are 2, are and are not. So what the copula does, right, is tie the subject term to the predicate term. So in our first example, are, our second example, are, our third example, are, and our fourth example, are not. And then finally we have the predicate term, and that's what's left over. So governments that encourage terrorism, films without blood, organizations on the brink of bankruptcy, and champions of human rights. Okay, so let's go back to the subject term. Right, so the subject term is that thing that comes between the quantifier, right, all, no, or some, and the copula, are and are not. And then our predicate term is what comes after the copula. Right, so governments that encourage terrorism, films without blood, organizations on the brink of bankruptcy, and champions of human rights. So here's a hint, right? When you're trying to identify the subject term and the predicate term, it might help to identify the quantifier and the copula first, right? And again, the subject term is going to be between the quantifier and the copula, and the predicate term is going to be what's after the copula. Okay, so let's quickly do some practice. Right, so what's the quantifier, subject term, copula, and predicate term of the following? No drug dealers are individuals who have public health in mind. So try to do this on your own, right? Tell me what the quantifier, the subject term, the copula, and the predicate term are. So the quantifier here is no, right? Remember the quantifier is either all, no, or some. The subject term is drug dealers, the copula is are, and the predicate term is individuals who have public health in mind. Here's another one. Some laundromats are places that are busy on Saturday mornings. What is the quantifier, subject term, copula, and predicate? Again, try to do this on your own. So our quantifier, right, is some, right, all, no, or some. Our subject term is laundromats. Our copula is are, and our predicate term is places that are busy on Saturday mornings. Here's another one. All restaurants with Michelin stars are places that are expensive for a first date. What's the quantifier, subject term, copula, and predicate term? Do this on your own. So all restaurants with Michelin stars are places that are expensive for a first date. Okay, so I hope that this is fairly straightforward and easy, right? I think the most work you're going to have to do, right, is memorizing what the quantifiers are, what the copulas are and are not, right, and figuring out how to identify subject terms and predicate terms. Again, the trick, right, is that the subject term comes between the quantifier and the copula, and the predicate comes after the copula.